The C-130J Super Hercules banked hard against the Afghan sky, its massive frame cutting through thermals that rose like invisible pillars from the desert below. Inside the aircraft's cavernous belly, Staff Sergeant Mazikeen, Mays, Voss gripped her wrench tighter as the turbulence threw her against the engine housing. The left Rolls-Royce I-2100D3 turboprop was running hot, dangerously hot. She'd been monitoring the temperature gauges for the past hour, watching the numbers climb like a countdown to disaster. What nobody knew, what the flight manifest didn't show, was that Mays wasn't supposed to be here at all. The original crew chief had come down with food poisoning 2 hours before takeoff, and she'd volunteered to fill the slot. Just a routine supply run to Forward Operating Base Chapman, they said. Nothing a backup mechanic couldn't handle. The intercom crackled to life. "Mays, how's our girl looking back there?" Captain Rodriguez's voice carried that forced calm that pilots perfected, the kind that meant everything was definitely not okay. She pressed her headset mic. "Temperature's climbing past red line, Captain. We're at 950 degrees and rising." Her voice was steady, professional. Years of being the only woman in most rooms had taught her to never let them hear doubt. The aircraft shuddered violently, and Mays watched in horror as metal shavings began spitting from the engine housing. The left engine was eating itself alive, 38,000 feet above some of the most hostile territory on Earth. They were carrying medical supplies for a forward hospital, insulin for diabetic soldiers who would die without it, and now they might not make it at all. "Rodriguez to base, we have engine failure on number 2. Requesting immediate vector to nearest friendly airfield." The radio response came back broken by static. "Negative. Hostile activity. Proceed to primary destination." Mays felt something cold settle in her stomach. They weren't just in trouble, they were on their own. She looked out the small porthole at the massive wing, watching the failing engine's propeller still spinning, still fighting. Below them, the Hindu Kush mountains stretched endlessly, their peaks like broken teeth against the horizon. She'd grown up in Montana, spent her childhood watching her father fix everything from crop dusters to semi-trucks. He'd taught her that machines had souls, that if you listened carefully enough, they'd tell you exactly what they needed. Right now, this machine was screaming. The left engine seized with a grinding shriek that shook the entire airframe. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the thin air, and suddenly they were flying on 3 engines, losing altitude fast. Through the cockpit door, she could see Captain Rodriguez and his co-pilot working frantically over their controls, but she knew what they didn't yet understand. This wasn't a job for pilots anymore. This was a job for someone who could make broken things fly. Captain Rodriguez had always been skeptical of female mechanics. Not openly. The Air Force had rules about that sort of thing, but Mays could see it in the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long on her work, double-checking torque specifications she'd already verified twice. He'd grown up in Texas, the son of a crop duster pilot, and in his world, women were supposed to stay on the ground. "Can you restart her?" he called back, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing cockpit temperature. Mays was already moving, her hands dancing across emergency panels most crew chiefs never had to touch. "Negative on restart, Captain. Compressors seized. We need to feather the prop and balance thrust on the remaining engines." "I know how to fly my aircraft, Sergeant." The edge in his voice was sharp enough to cut, but Mays had heard worse. She'd spent 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and had been called everything from wrench queen to things that would make a drill sergeant blush. What mattered now wasn't Rodriguez's ego. It was the fact that they were bleeding altitude at 800 feet per minute, and the mountains below were getting uncomfortably close. She keyed her mic to the entire crew. "Listen up. We're going to lose hydraulic pressure in about 10 minutes. When that happens, the flight controls are going to get heavy, real heavy." Her voice carried across the intercom with the kind of authority that came from experience, not rank. The loadmaster, Tech Sergeant Williams, looked up from his cargo manifest. How heavy are we talking, Mays? Remember that C-130 that went down in Germany last year? Same failure mode. Crew couldn't maintain controlled flight. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone aboard knew that story. Everyone knew how it ended. Rodriguez's voice came back tight with concentration. Mays, I need options. Real ones. She closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing the aircraft systems like a three-dimensional puzzle in her mind. Her father had taught her this trick: when everything's going to hell, step back and see the whole picture. The C-130 was a tough bird, over-engineered and built to take punishment. But it wasn't invincible. Sir, there's something we can try. It's not in any manual, and it's probably going to get us all court-martialed if we survive it. I'm listening. Through the cockpit windows, the Hindu Kush peaks seemed to be reaching up toward them like grasping fingers. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valleys, and Mays could see the serpentine path of a river far below, silver against the brown earth. Beautiful country, if it wasn't trying to kill you. We're going to manually control engine power, bypass the normal governors, and use differential thrust to maintain directional control. I'll need to be at the engine control panel, calling out power settings based on what I'm seeing. Rodriguez turned in his seat to look at her directly. For the first time since takeoff, his expression wasn't dismissive. It was calculating, measuring her against the enormity of what she was proposing. That's pilot work, Sergeant. Yes, sir, it is. The C-130 lurched sickeningly as another piece of the damaged engine departed the aircraft somewhere over the Khyber Pass. Through her headset, Mays could hear the automated warning systems painting an increasingly grim picture. Hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical systems fluctuating, and the remaining 3 engines working harder than they were ever designed to. She'd already moved to the engineer's panel, her hands finding switches and controls by feel alone. This was where the real flying happened, not just pushing the stick and hopping for the best, but understanding every system, every backup, every last-ditch option that might keep them airborne for another few precious minutes. Rodriguez, I'm going to need you to trust me, she said, and something in her voice made him pause. Tech Sergeant Williams was looking at her with something approaching awe. He'd served with her for 8 months, had seen her rebuild engines that senior mechanics had written off as total losses, had watched her diagnose problems that stumped officers with engineering degrees. But this was different. This was betting their lives on her ability to make a broken machine perform miracles. What's your call sign, Mays? Williams asked suddenly. She paused, her hands still working across the control panel. Nobody had ever asked her that before. In the maintenance world, call signs were for pilots, not the people who fixed their aircraft. Lazarus, she said quietly. The name hung in the air for a moment, and Williams nodded slowly. It fit. She brought back aircraft that everyone else had declared dead, coaxed life from machines that should have been spare parts. Now they needed her to resurrect them all. Okay, Lazarus, Rodriguez said, and for the first time there was no skepticism in his voice. Talk me through it. The mountains below seemed closer now, their peaks wreathed in clouds that looked deceptively soft from altitude. Mays knew better. Those clouds hid rocks that would tear through aluminum like paper, winds that could flip a damaged aircraft upside down in seconds, and terrain that offered exactly zero margin for error. She keyed her mic and began to work miracles. Engine 3, increase power to 95%. Engine 4, back down to 80. I need to feel the aircraft respond before we go any further. The C-130 answered immediately, the subtle change in engine note audible even over the wind noise and failing systems. Rodriguez fought the rudder pedals as the aircraft tried to yaw left, but Mays was already compensating, calling out power adjustments like a conductor directing an orchestra of controlled explosions. That's it. Now Engine 1 bring it up to 92%, Engine 4 down to 78. They were flying the aircraft like a boat with one oar, using thrust differentials to maintain heading and altitude. It was crude, dangerous, and absolutely not in any flight manual ever written. It was also working. The radio crackled to life. Unknown aircraft, this is Bagram Tower. You are approaching restricted airspace. State your intentions. Rodriguez keyed his mic. Bagram Tower, this is Reach 394, declaring emergency. We have engine failure and are requesting immediate landing clearance. Reach 394, understand emergency. Be advised, runway 21 is occupied by combat operations. Can you hold for 15 minutes? Mays checked the fuel gauges and shook her head. They had maybe 10 minutes of flying time left, and that was if nothing else decided to break. She looked out at the failing light, at the way the shadows were lengthening across the valley floors, and made a decision that would either save them all or kill them all. Negative on the hold, tower. We're coming in now, whether the runway's clear or not. Through the cockpit windows, she could see Bagram Air Base in the distance, its runways etched in light against the gathering darkness. It looked impossibly small, impossibly far away, like a postage stamp viewed from orbit. But it was their only chance. The hydraulic pressure finally gave up completely with a shudder that ran through the entire airframe. Rodriguez grunted as the controls suddenly required both hands and all his strength just to maintain level flight. Mays, I can barely hold her steady. How much longer? She was running calculations in her head, fuel consumption versus distance versus the rate at which their situation was deteriorating. The math wasn't encouraging. 6 minutes to touchdown, if we can maintain current descent rate. And if we can't? She didn't answer immediately. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, pinpricks of light against the infinite black. Her father had taught her their names during long nights in the Montana wilderness, had told her that as long as you could see the stars, you weren't truly lost. She keyed her mic to the entire crew. Everyone strap in tight. This is going to get interesting. The word interesting was military understatement at its finest. What she meant was that they were about to attempt a landing that would require every skill she'd learned in 12 years of keeping aircraft flying, every trick her father had taught her about machines and momentum, and a fair amount of luck that they probably didn't deserve. Through her headset, she could hear Rodriguez breathing heavily as he fought the increasingly unresponsive controls. This was the moment when good pilots became great ones, or when they became cautionary tales whispered in ready rooms for decades to come. Bagram Tower came back on the radio. Reach 394, combat operations complete. You are cleared to land runway 21. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Mays allowed herself one moment of relief before focusing on the approach. The runway lights were visible now, a string of pearls laid out against the dark earth, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Beginning final approach, she announced, her hands already moving to adjust engine power for the last time. The C-130 descended through the night sky over Afghanistan like a wounded bird, its remaining engines singing a discordant song of controlled violence. Mays had never felt more alive, or more aware that she might have only seconds left to live. But she'd brought them this far. She wasn't going to fail them now. Bagram Air Base stretched out below them like a constellation fallen to earth, its perimeter lights tracing geometric patterns against the ancient landscape of the Hindu Kush. Mays could see the emergency vehicles lined up along the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, crash recovery equipment, all waiting for them to either perform a miracle or become a cautionary tale. Runway in sight, Rodriguez called out, his voice tight with concentration. Mays, I need power adjustments every 10 seconds from here on out. Copy that. Engine 1 maintain 92%. Engine 3 reduced to 88. Engine 4 increased to 90. The aircraft responded sluggishly, like a heavyweight boxer in the final rounds, still fighting but running on heart and muscle memory. Through the side windows, Mays could see the ground rushing up to meet them, the approach lights strobing past in measured intervals that marked their descent into either salvation or disaster. 200 feet, Rodriguez called. 150. 100. The runway threshold flashed beneath them, concrete and steel that represented the difference between coming home and becoming a smoking crater. Mays felt the main landing gear kiss the runway with surprising gentleness. Then the nose gear followed suit with a solid thump that resonated through the entire airframe. They were down. Rodriguez immediately deployed every drag-inducing device the aircraft possessed: speed brakes, reverse thrust on the working engines, wheel brakes applied with increasing pressure as their speed bled off from 140 knots to 100 to 60 to taxi speed. The emergency vehicles paralleled their rollout, red and blue lights painting everything in alternating patterns of urgency and relief. When they finally came to a complete stop at the end of the runway, the silence was deafening. No engine noise, no wind rushing past the fuselage, no automated warnings or radio chatter. Just the subtle cooling sounds of hot metal contracting and the distant whine of approaching emergency vehicles. Rodriguez turned in his seat to look at Mays directly. His face was drawn with exhaustion, streaked with sweat despite the cold, but his eyes held something she'd never seen there before: respect. "Sergeant Voss," he said formally, "that was the finest piece of flying I've ever witnessed, and I've been doing this for 15 years. Williams was already up and moving toward the cargo door, but he paused long enough to add, "Lazarus indeed. You just brought us back from the dead." Mays felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. For years, she'd been proving herself over and over again, earning respect one successful repair at a time. Tonight, she'd earned something different, something that couldn't be taken away by the next skeptical pilot or dismissive crew chief. The cargo door lowered with its familiar hydraulic whine, and the Afghan night air flooded in, carrying with it the sense of diesel fuel, hot concrete, and possibility. Outside, she could see the emergency responders standing down, their crisis averted by her ability to make broken things whole again. As they deplaned, Rodriguez caught her arm gently. "Mays, I owe you an apology, several of them actually." She looked at him for a long moment, this pilot who'd spent the flight learning to trust her judgment over his own preconceptions. "Just remember it next time you've got a female mechanic on your crew, sir." He nodded soberly. "I will, that's a promise." The debrief took 3 hours, with everyone from the wing commander to the accident investigation team wanting to understand exactly how they'd managed to bring a catastrophically damaged aircraft home safely. Mays explained her methodology with the same precision she brought to everything else, walking them through the power management techniques and control inputs that had kept them airborne. What she didn't mention was the moment during the approach when she'd closed her eyes and felt her father's presence, heard his voice saying what he'd always said when a repair seemed impossible. "Every machine wants to work, Mays. Sometimes you just have to help it remember how." The official report would credit exceptional airmanship and innovative emergency procedures for the successful outcome. It would recommend both Rodriguez and Mays for commendation, and it would become required reading at flight training schools for years to come. But that night, sitting in the maintenance hangar with a cup of terrible coffee and the satisfaction of a job well done, Mays knew that she'd crossed some invisible threshold. She wasn't just a mechanic anymore, wasn't just someone who fixed things so other people could fly them. She was Lazarus. The nickname stuck, spreading through the squadron like wildfire over the next few weeks. It started with Williams, who couldn't seem to stop telling the story to anyone who would listen, but soon even the officers were using it. Not mockingly, not with the subtle dismissiveness she'd grown accustomed to, but with something approaching reverence. "You need to talk to Lazarus about that engine," became common parlance. "Lazarus says the hydraulic system needs attention. If Lazarus can't fix it, it can't be fixed." The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. When she walked into the hangar each morning, conversations didn't stop the way they used to. When she diagnosed a problem, mechanics twice her age listened without question. When pilots had concerns about their aircraft, they sought her out specifically. Rodriguez had kept his promise. More than that, he'd become something of an evangelist for her skills, telling the story of their emergency landing to anyone who would listen. The official version was impressive enough: engine failure, emergency procedures, successful landing. But the way he told it made it clear who the real hero had been that night. "She flew that aircraft better than I did," he'd say, "and she was doing it from the engineer's panel while I was just trying to keep us pointed in the right direction." The commendation came through 6 weeks later. Distinguished Flying Cross, with a citation that read in part, "For extraordinary heroism while participating in aerial flight under emergency conditions. Sergeant Voss demonstrated exceptional technical skill and innovative thinking that directly resulted in the successful recovery of a critically damaged aircraft and the preservation of 4 lives." Her father flew out from Montana for the ceremony, his weathered face creasing into a smile as the base commander pinned the medal to her dress uniform. Afterward, as they walked across the flight line in the golden light of late afternoon, he stopped next to a C-130 undergoing routine maintenance. "You know what I'm proudest of," he said, running his hand along the aircraft's fuselage with the unconscious familiarity of someone who'd spent his life around machines. "What's that, Dad?" "Not that you saved those men, though I'm proud of that too. It's that you remembered what I taught you about listening to machines, about understanding that they're not just metal and wires, they're partners." Maze nodded, understanding flowing between them like a current. She'd grown up watching him coax life from engines that everyone else had written off, had learned at his side that mechanical sympathy wasn't just technical knowledge. It was intuition, empathy, the ability to feel what a machine needed before it even knew itself. That night she stood on the flight line under the vast Afghan sky, looking up at the same stars her father had taught her to name years ago in the Montana wilderness. The war would continue, aircraft would break, and she would fix them. But something fundamental had changed in the way she saw herself, in the way others saw her. She was no longer just the backup mechanic who'd happened to be in the right place at the right time. She was Lazarus, the one who brought the dead back to life. The legend began to grow beyond the confines of Bagram Air Base. In the interconnected world of military aviation, stories traveled fast, especially ones involving dramatic saves and innovative solutions. Within months, mechanics at bases across Afghanistan and beyond had heard various versions of the tale, some accurate, some embellished, all focused on the woman who'd flown a broken aircraft better than most pilots could fly a healthy one. Other incidents followed, not as dramatic as the engine failure over the Hindu Kush, but each one adding another layer to her growing reputation. There was the hydraulic failure that grounded an entire squadron until Mays jury-rigged a temporary fix using parts from 3 different aircraft. The electrical fire that she diagnosed and isolated in under 10 minutes, preventing what could have been a catastrophic hangar explosion. The landing gear malfunction that she solved by literally crawling inside the aircraft's belly while it was in flight, rewiring systems with a flashlight clenched between her teeth. Each success brought new challenges, as commanders began specifically requesting her for the most difficult problems. She found herself traveling between bases, a troubleshooter sent in when conventional solutions had failed. Her toolkit expanded beyond standard mechanics tools to include items most crew chiefs had never seen: specialized electronic diagnostic equipment, custom fabricated parts, and a growing collection of impossible repairs that she'd somehow managed to accomplish. The young mechanics began to seek her out for training, drawn by both her reputation and her willingness to share knowledge that went beyond what was taught in technical school. She'd found herself becoming a teacher without ever having made a conscious decision to do so, passing on not just technical skills, but the deeper understanding that separated good mechanics from exceptional ones. Don't just memorize the procedures, she'd tell them. Understand why they exist. Every system on this aircraft has a purpose, and every failure tells you a story if you know how to listen. She'd take them through complex diagnostics step by step, showing them how to trace problems through interconnected systems, how to recognize the subtle signs that indicated an impending failure hours or days before it became critical. More importantly, she taught them to trust their instincts, to pay attention to the small voices in their heads that said something wasn't quite right. Your intuition is built from thousands of hours of experience, even if you don't realize it yet. When something feels wrong, investigate it. The aircraft is trying to tell you something. The war itself became a backdrop to her growing legend, the constant cycle of missions and maintenance, of aircraft going out and coming back damaged, of making do with limited resources and impossible deadlines. But for Mays, the war was personal in a way that went beyond politics or strategy. Every aircraft she repaired carried people she knew, people who depended on her skill to bring them home safely. There was Captain Martinez, who always brought her coffee when his C-130 needed attention, and who'd named his daughter after her when she was born back in Texas. There was Lieutenant Kim, fresh out of flight school and terrified of making mistakes, whom Mays had taken under her wing and taught to see aircraft maintenance not as a necessary evil, but as a partnership between human and machine. There was Master Sergeant Johnson, a loadmaster with 23 years of service and a Purple Heart from Iraq, who told her once that he'd requested assignment to any crew that included her because he knew that if something went wrong, she'd find a way to get them home. These relationships, built in the crucible of shared danger and mutual dependence, became the emotional foundation of her reputation. She wasn't just fixing machines. She was protecting people, ensuring that husbands returned to wives, that mothers came home to children, that young airmen had the chance to grow old and tell their own stories. The transformation in how she was perceived was perhaps most evident in the pilot's ready room, a space that had always been subtly off-limits to enlisted personnel, especially female enlisted personnel. Now, when complex maintenance issues arose during mission planning, it wasn't uncommon for the discussion to pause while someone went to find Mays and bring her into the conversation. Lazarus, we're looking at a mission to Kandahar with a full cargo load and questionable weather. The aircraft's been having intermittent electrical issues. What's your assessment? She'd study the maintenance logs, ask pointed questions about symptoms and operating conditions, then deliver a judgment that carried more weight than formal inspections or computer diagnostics. The electrical issues are related to moisture infiltration in the overhead panel. Fixable, but it'll take 4 hours and will need parts from the boneyard. If you can delay the mission until tomorrow afternoon, I can guarantee you a fully mission-capable aircraft. If you can't wait, there's an 80% chance you'll lose half your electrical systems somewhere over the mountains. The pilots learned to trust these assessments completely, understanding that she wasn't just guessing. She was synthesizing years of experience with an intuitive understanding of how aircraft behaved under stress. Her recommendations became the basis for mission go-no-go decisions, her word carrying the weight of life-and-death responsibility. But perhaps the most significant change was internal, in how Mays saw herself and her role in the larger machinery of war. She'd entered the military as someone seeking steady employment and technical training, had found herself assigned to aircraft maintenance almost by accident. Now, she understood that she'd discovered something deeper, a calling that went beyond job description or career advancement. She was a guardian, a keeper of the thin line between the possible and the impossible, between coming home and not coming home. Every successful repair, every innovative solution, every aircraft that returned safely from a mission because she'd found and fixed a problem that others had missed, all of it was part of a larger tapestry of service that she was finally beginning to understand. The war in Afghanistan was winding down by the time Mays received orders for her next assignment, but the legend of Lazarus had taken on a life of its own. Stories of her innovations had made their way into official Air Force technical publications. Her emergency procedures had been incorporated into training curricula at maintenance schools across the country. Young mechanics who'd never met her spoke of her techniques with the kind of reverence usually reserved for generals or test pilots. The farewell ceremony at Bagram was unlike anything she'd experienced. Officers who'd barely acknowledged her existence during her first years of service stood to applaud as she was presented with a squadron coin, not the standard issue given to all departing personnel, but a special one commissioned specifically for her, bearing the image of a C-130 rising from flames with the word Lazarus etched below. Captain Rodriguez, now Major Rodriguez and the squadron commander, gave a speech that was both personal and professional, touching on her technical innovations but focusing primarily on her character and the way she'd changed the culture of the entire unit. Sergeant Voss, Mays, Lazarus, has taught us that excellence isn't about rank or gender or background. It's about dedication, innovation, and the courage to take responsibility when lives are on the line. She's shown us that sometimes the most important person on a flight crew isn't sitting in the cockpit. It's the person who made sure the aircraft was worthy of the trust we place in it. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, but what Mays remembered most clearly was the moment afterward, when the youngest mechanic in the squadron, a 19-year-old airman from Ohio who'd arrived just 2 months earlier, approached her nervously. "Sergeant Voss, ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you for showing me that this job, what we do, it matters. It really matters." She looked at this kid, barely out of high school, still learning to find his way in the complex world of military service and adult responsibility, and saw something of herself from years ago. The uncertainty, the desire to prove himself, the gradual realization that technical skill was just the beginning of what this job required. "It does matter," she told him. "More than you know. Take care of these birds and they'll take care of you. And remember, every aircraft wants to work. Sometimes you just have to help it remember how." The flight home was on a commercial airliner, a jarring transition from the military world of cargo aircraft and emergency repairs to the civilian reality of assigned seats and flight attendants serving peanuts. But as Mays looked out the window at the landscape passing below, first the mountains of Afghanistan, then the cities of Europe, finally the familiar coastline of the United States, she found herself thinking not about the past, but about the future. Her new assignment was to Edwards Air Force Base in California, where she'd be working on experimental aircraft modifications and advanced maintenance techniques. It was a prestigious posting, the kind typically reserved for officers or senior NCOs with decades of experience. The fact that she'd been selected at her current rank, based primarily on her reputation as an innovator and problem solver, was both an honor and a challenge. But as the airliner began its descent toward Los Angeles International Airport, banking over the Pacific Ocean in the golden light of late afternoon, Mays felt ready for whatever came next. She was Lazarus, the one who brought dead things back to life, and she had more work to do. The legend would continue to grow, would inspire a new generation of mechanics and maintainers, would change the way the Air Force thought about technical expertise and problem solving. But for now, she was just a woman coming home from war, carrying with her the knowledge that she'd found her calling in the most unlikely of places, in the belly of a failing aircraft, 38,000 feet above Afghanistan, when everything that could go wrong had gone wrong and someone had needed to make it right. She'd been the backup mechanic, until the left engine failed and she took control. Now she was something more. Edwards Air Force Base sprawled across the Mojave Desert like a testament to humanity's determination to conquer the sky. Home to the Air Force Test Center, it was where the impossible became routine, where experimental aircraft pushed the boundaries of physics and engineering, where test pilots and engineers collaborated on machines that wouldn't officially exist for years to come. Mais's first day began before sunrise, the desert air still cool from the night as she walked across the flight line toward a hangar that housed aircraft she'd only seen in classified technical manuals. The YF-23 prototype sat silent in the corner, its angular stealth surfaces drinking in the fluorescent light. Nearby, a modified C-130 bristled with electronic warfare equipment that transformed it from a simple cargo hauler into something that belonged in a science fiction movie. Her new supervisor, Chief Master Sergeant Patricia Pat Kowalski, was a legend in her own right, 30 years of service, with tour at every major test facility in the Air Force. She'd been breaking barriers for female mechanics since before Mais was born, and her reputation for technical excellence was matched only by her ability to spot talent and nurture it. "So you're Lazarus," Pat said without preamble, looking up from a maintenance manual thick enough to stop bullets. "I've been hearing stories about you for months. Some of them might even be true." Mais smiled, probably only about half, "Chief. That's still enough to be impressive. Come on, let me show you what we do here." The tour that followed was unlike anything from her previous assignments. Where Bagram had been about keeping operational aircraft flying under combat conditions, Edwards was about pushing machines beyond their design limits to discover what was possible. Every aircraft in the hangar represented years of development and millions of dollars, but more than that, they represented dreams made manifest, the collective vision of engineers, pilots, and mechanics working together to redefine what flight could be. "Your job here," Pat explained as they stood before a modified F-16 that had been transformed into a flying laboratory, "isn't just to fix things when they break. It's to anticipate failures before they happen, to innovate solutions that don't exist in any manual, and to help push the boundaries of what these machines can do." It was a challenge that appealed to every instinct Mais had developed over years of solving impossible problems. But it was also intimidating in a way that combat maintenance never had been. In Afghanistan, success was measured in missions completed and people brought home safely. Here, success would be measured against the unknown, against theoretical possibilities that existed only in the minds of engineers, and the hope that human ingenuity could overcome the laws of physics. Her first assignment was typical of Edwards, straightforward on the surface, fiendishly complex underneath. A modified KC-135 tanker was experiencing intermittent flight control anomalies during high-altitude refueling operations. The symptoms were subtle, barely detectable deviations in control response that occurred only under very specific conditions of altitude, airspeed, and fuel load. 3 different investigation teams had already examined the aircraft. The manufacturer's engineers had run computer simulations. The Air Force's best avionics specialists had replaced every component in the flight control system twice. The problem persisted. "It's yours now," Pat told her, handing over a maintenance folder thick with technical reports, test data, and frustrated engineering analyses. "Figure it out." Mais spent the first week doing what she'd always done, listening. Not just to the engines and hydraulic systems, but to the aircraft itself, learning its rhythms and moods, understanding how it behaved in different configurations. She flew on test missions, strapped into an observer seat behind the cockpit, feeling the subtle vibrations and control inputs that the pilots had learned to compensate for without conscious thought. The breakthrough came during a routine maintenance inspection, when she noticed something that everyone else had dismissed as irrelevant. The aircraft's center of gravity calculations were correct for normal operations, but during high-altitude refueling, when thousands of pounds of fuel were being transferred through the boom. The dynamic loading created resonance frequencies that interacted with the flight control system in ways that weren't accounted for in any technical manual. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a design limitation that only became apparent under very specific operational conditions. The solution required custom software modifications and structural reinforcements that had to be engineered from scratch. "How long did it take you to figure that out?" Pat asked when Mays presented her findings. "2 weeks. The previous team spent 6 months and never got close. You want to know why?" Mays waited. "Because they were looking for what was broken. You were looking for what was different. That's the difference between a good mechanic and an exceptional one." The commendation that followed was nice, but more important was the phone call from the Pentagon 3 days later. The modifications Mays had developed for the KC-135 were being incorporated into the entire tanker fleet. Her innovative approach to dynamic loading analysis was being studied by engineers at Boeing and Lockheed Martin. Her name was being mentioned in discussions about the future of aircraft maintenance and systems integration. She was building a reputation that transcended military hierarchy, that existed in the rarefied world of aerospace engineering and advanced systems development. But more importantly, she was finding herself surrounded by people who understood what she'd always known, that the relationship between human and machine was a partnership, not a dictatorship, and that the best solutions often came from listening rather than commanding. The culture at Edwards was different from anything she'd experienced. Rank mattered less than capability. Gender was largely irrelevant in the face of technical excellence. What counted was results, innovation, and the ability to solve problems that had never been solved before. For the first time in her military career, Mays found herself in an environment where her gender was truly invisible, where her ideas were evaluated purely on their merit, where her reputation had preceded her to the extent that bias was simply irrelevant. It was liberating in ways she hadn't expected, allowing her to focus entirely on the work itself, rather than on proving herself worthy of the work. The months that followed brought a series of increasingly complex challenges. A stealth bomber with radar signature anomalies that turned out to be caused by microscopic variations in surface coating thickness. An experimental hypersonic research vehicle that kept losing.